It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome the 2022 Holberg laureate, Professor Sheila Jasanoff, to the Holberg Conversation. Welcome and congratulations.
Thank you. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here and a huge pleasure to be sitting across the room from you.
So in the wording of the Holberg Committee, you are awarded the Holberg Prize for your, and now I quote, your pioneering research in the field of science and technology studies, end of quote. Science and technology studies, we will probably abbreviate to STS in the course of the conversation. We will return to what this academic field is and what it affords, not the least because your work and your ideas have spread across the social sciences and humanities far beyond this field of STS, and actually also into the natural sciences and medicine in debates within and perhaps around natural sciences and medicine. First, however, I would like to introduce you to the viewers with some basic facts. You are the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. You have authored or edited more than 15 books and in numerous book chapters and research papers. I believe the count is on more than 130. And you've held visiting professorships and other research appointments around the globe, I would say. Oxford and Cambridge, Kyoto and Melbourne, MIT and Yale, and more. And importantly, your work takes many other roles, such as giving policy advice to national and international governmental organizations, such as the OECD and the European Commission, and if I'm not mistaken, as we're sitting here in Norway, including the Research Council of Norway. Indeed, the Holberg Committee describes you as a significant public intellectual of our time, and I would add, at several continents. In addition to being a highly productive scholar, pedagogue, a strong academic community builder within STS, and that over several decades. So, if I may, I would like to ask you what motivates your work at such a broad front and with so much energy for decades. What is your main source of motivation?
I think that the primary source of motivation is actually our profession, which is pedagogy, and that brings us continually in contact with new young minds that are just setting out on their way. And I think there's nothing more exciting than sharing one's own sense of discovery with these younger people. And they come, every year. That's a continually self-regenerating supply of people to think with and work with. But I think that I've felt a particular sense of responsibility toward these younger people, something that maybe people in more jaded disciplines don't have the experience of. A number of years ago, by now it's, pushing 30, we had the opportunity, my colleagues and I at Cornell University, to build a new department. But building a new department meant building a degree program, in fact, a couple of degree programs that had not existed before. And I remember thinking that this is a very unfair exchange, that these young people in their mid-20s are going to come to me. They may be pushing 30 by the time they leave after a 5 or 6 year program. I will give them a piece of paper. They will have given me and my department years of their lives. So what is in that exchange? What is it that we're teaching? And I think that the attempt to solve that to my own satisfaction, that there should be substance there, that it should be skills building, intellectual skills, but skills with which they would go out into the world and be able to do new and different things. And I think that that has been from, back in the late 80s, early 90s, through until now, one of the major motivating factors in what I do.
Then also at Harvard University, this was broadened, I believe, into receiving young scholars from around the world in the visiting
Yes, I'm extremely fortunate that way to be at Harvard because Cornell, despite all of its many virtues, is located in a place that it has to be the Endstation, as it were. You have to intend to go there. Nobody's ever passing through. Whereas Cambridge, Massachusetts is a bit different. Harvard is a goal in that respect. I mean, of course, many people want to say that they spent some time there. So I was able to gather together a meeting place, again, for much more junior scholars, but who know that they will come there and find a community. And, you know, one of the joyful moments of my life was when a dear Italian, now colleague and friend, said to me that she hadn't really understood what Europe was till she came to my program. So I think in that sense it has been identity building for people coming there who end up seeing themselves as STS scholars in a way different from how they would have seen themselves before, and also as part of a global community of young scholars. And, you know, in that respect, it's articulating more the ideals of the medieval university, I think, than the modernist, siloed, isolating version that we're all familiar with as well.
Yeah, it's building a community.
We remember the term thought collective that Ludwig Fleck, one of the founders of the field, used back in the 1930s. And that term, I think, still remains a very important one to me, both the thought and the collective. I mean, that is, it's ways of thought. It's building patterns of mutual recognition so that people don't have to explain themselves to one another. I mean, after all, that is why we like our mother tongues and we like our home disciplines. This is a different kind of building because it's, in a way, the STS community, as it has grown up, is a place without walls. It's very porous. So one has to do something more, something special, to achieve that sense of recognition that we're engaged in the same critical project, regardless where we stand, and we understand each other. So that has been, again, something... You know, nobody taught me how to do these things. It's, again, part of the commitment comes from trying to figure this out as one is going along. You stop after every year or every couple of years and say, no, what was it that I was doing? What is the thing that worked? So it's this experimental side to it as well.
And that's the pioneering role, I would say. Let's move into, you mentioned Fleck's concept of the thought collective. So let's start the journey into asking what kind of thought style do we have in this thought collective. And I would like to turn again to the written statement of the Holberg Committee that writes that, I quote again, "A central insight in Jasanoff's work is that science, technology, and modern society are co-produced." So to those who are less familiar with your work, how would you unpack this insight and the concept of co-production?
Well, there are simple ways of doing it and deeper ways of doing it, but let's begin with the simple side of it. For a long time, people thought that human progress happened in a linear fashion since the Enlightenment, that we get to understand what nature is and what reality is better and better, and then we shape ourselves accordingly. And to some extent, it's the accumulation of knowledge that drives human futures forward. So along came STS as a field in the 1970s, and, you know, obviously with older roots, but it began to institutionalize in a certain way in the 70s. And STS scholars thought about, well, what would it look like if we reversed that trajectory and instead said, well, how is it that we come to understand these truths in the first place? And that became, I think, a key element of the thought style of STS, which is constructivism. That is, look at any reality in the face, and what's interesting is not that it is there, but that it somehow came to be. Now, people complained that, well and good, but this bears the risk of relativizing things and suggesting that all futures are possible. And of course, that's not so. I mean, anybody who does longue durée history understands that there are pathways that are harder to break out of. So somewhere in that oscillation between a realist way of understanding the world, where the world is pre-given and it's exogenous and we just get better and better at finding it, and the constructivist imagination that says, hold on, it's all representation, all discourse, and therefore you can take it apart. Give me any reality and I'll take it apart. Somewhere in the middle is a synthesis that, yes, it is constructed. Everything that we know and do took certain forms because we knew and did it, and the we is variable at different times and places. But nevertheless, there is a coherence, what I call a stickiness, a durability of the world, and it behooves us to try to understand those sort of platform places where things plateau out and bear a certain shape over longer periods of time. I think it matters that I came from training in law. And of course, law is a quintessential field that has grappled with this problem of change and stability for a long time. Ideology in the law is often about what is the thing that you hold still and what is it that you allow to shift. In American constitutional law, this is an ongoing and still very live battle. What status do you give to the written words? And what if they don't mean the same thing anymore that they meant a couple of hundred years ago? So I think I was prepared to think about a kind of dynamic hybrid of the stable and the unstable. Co-production is really the label that we give to that somehow the world, as we understand it, does come out of a set of human aspirations, human curiosity, but at the same time, it constrains the world. Once we've decided this is how we want to look, then it shapes what we do next.
You mentioned several times now that the co-production perspective perhaps is somewhere in between, or as a synthesis between, let's say, a realist understanding of science, and that perhaps still is somewhat taught implicitly within the natural sciences, within medicine, perhaps even in social sciences sometimes. And then on the other hand, there is the Charybdis, as it were, of the relativism, and it could be that some of the views have some reminiscence of what was called the science wars. That also, even in Norway, we had a touch of it, which mostly implied a rather hostile climate of conversation between parts of the natural sciences on one hand and parts of the social sciences and the humanities on the other hand. Would you say that your synthesis is also a result of these hostilities or these debates?
I actually don't think so. I think a historian looking at the science wars would recognize that Cornell University, which was the only university with a full-fledged department of STS, never suffered from it. Our offices were in the same building as the physicists, and my dear and now late colleague Trevor Pinch was talking to the physicists all the time. We were all talking to the scientists. I think that if STS is carefully done, which is the project of understanding the cultures of science and technology in such a way that it helps to understand the broader human cultures in which we are all embedded, that project is something that scientists respect. Now, it may bring home some findings that make them uncomfortable at times, but my own experience is that support for STS, the kind of STS that I am associated with, has always benefited from this strong support of scientists, and that includes people in the more complex sciences like ecology and medicine, as well as people who are doing the purest of the pure, theory-driven and curiosity-driven research. Now, sometimes it's a live and let live. I don't quite know what these people are doing, but it's important. I don't even want to know very much because it might make me slightly angry. But I think that there is a mutual respect. Of course, STS scholars have to respect the thing they're studying in the same way that an anthropologist respects the other culture that they are trying to understand in some way. So I think that carefully done with honesty, sincerity, and actual observation of things that are happening, the project is the same in any of the rigorous scientific fields, whether it's a humanistic field or a natural science field.
Yeah, carefully done, I think, is a key word here. So let's move a little bit further into the Denkstil, or the thought style. Mm-hmm. So in this conversation, we are both saying STS because we are used to saying STS, and yet perhaps for many people this is the first time they hear this abbreviation, at least in this particular meaning, science and technology studies. Would you like to tell us something about what do STSs do in practice? How is co-production also a methodological framework for the actual research that you do and your colleagues and all your students?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that question. STS is blessed or cursed with standing for two quite different things. And in a sense, the grand synthesis of STS that I think I stand for is an attempt to bring those two streams together. So there's science and technology studies, which has tended to mean the study of science and technology as themselves self-contained autonomous institutions. How do they function? How do they meet their own goals? And a key thing that people began studying was facticity. Science is that field of knowledge that produces facts, things we take for granted about the natural or social worlds. So how is it that these facts come into being, and what is a fact sociologically seen, as opposed to the philosopher's fact or even the natural scientist's fact? So that is one stream of STS, but at the same time, STS has always also stood for science, technology, and society. And that is a somewhat more outward-looking thing. That says that science and technology are extremely powerful institutions in the world. People are continually instrumentalizing scientific knowledge and technological developments to change the world in different ways. Some of the earliest legendary feats of science and technology, after all, were in the service of monarchs and designed to help them overcome what it was. I mean, so the architecture of the labyrinth so that the Minotaur could be found and conquered or kept, within limits. It's a metaphor for our time as well. So Daedalus, who may be seen in some ways as a forerunner of the modern technological enterprise, was in service to royalty, to power. So in that sense, science and technology have been employed to have effects on society, and we should understand those effects as well. And lately, that includes a profound wrestling with the idea of ethics and responsibility in science and technology, something that, of course, your own work has deeply gone into as well in connection with the medical sciences, for example. So I think that the field needs to recognize that these are not two separate trajectories, that in order to understand the impacts of science and technology on and in society, you have to have a clear idea of how science and technology in their various manifestations are actually working. What is expertise? How is knowledge produced to be? How do scientists make their better and worse judgments, for instance? This is not relativizing. This is an attempt to understand how we know that some claim is better or stronger or more reliable than other claims. This is a very important piece of the picture, because without knowing that, we would not know how to bring science and technology into public life. So in my view, STS is a magical abbreviation, because when you look inside it, it has these two meanings. In our field, there is this idea of the boundary object, where everybody agrees what the contours of the object are. But then you ask people, well, what is it? And they'll give you different definitions. So one could see that as a source of weakness, or one could see that as a source of strength. I mean, so I think apparently firm boundaries that encompass within them a richness of discourse and a multiplicity of areas of inquiry, that actually makes for a kind of tensile strength in the product, as I see it.
So we'll stay with STS as an abbreviation. Yes.
We will definitely stay with STS as an abbreviation, but recognizing that there are legitimately multiple worlds of inquiry. And you asked specifically, well, what is it that STS people do? And I think they do every bit as much varied things as people in any field. I mean, you go into sociology and, what does a sociologist do? Well, a sociologist may say, I study society, but that society could be a unique little community of people who hold weird beliefs, just as an anthropologist might, or it could be looking at grand social structures like what is the sociology of the state. And in that same sense, I think STS scholars could be doing extremely focused studies of particular inventions and discoveries, particular research communities, particular technological inventions, but they could also be looking at broader sweeping things. I mean, how is it that, for instance, in my own work, the law as a field grapples with indeterminacy in the sciences, and how does law come to normatively binding conclusions if facticity is always, by definition, in dispute in the courts? So how is it that one achieves stability in the face of argumentation, contestation? That is a very general problem for human beings and human societies. And it's quite different from, what has the study of the microbiome brought into our understanding of the human.
Mm. And I would think perhaps you would like to comment on that, but I would think that part of your contribution as an academic community builder also was to find a place for all these different approaches, as it were, from legal scholars to anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, that could in a way meet in the co-production idiom and work together.
So I do see my enterprise as imperialist in a certain sense, because I'm trying to shoehorn a new discipline into one of the most conservative cultures, academia, that people have ever invented. I mean, at any given moment, somehow academics tend to think that the way that their world is mapped is the only conceivable way. And here I am trying to build a new island and say, sorry, no, this space was unoccupied before. I'm not a settler colonialist. I am making the very territory that I'm wanting my people to occupy, in a sense. And that is hard going. But I think that in the end, like all good enterprises that are intellectual in nature, it requires defining yourself, stating your position, arguing for it, but in a spirit of charity. I mean, so I recognize, and I think all STS scholars should, that the problems we grapple with are not unique to us. We want to understand the nature of power, the nature of authority, but so do most fields. We want to understand the good, but so do most social science fields also want to do that, and philosophy also. So in order to circumscribe our territory, we have to have somewhat friendly relations with our neighbors to the sides and say, yes, I understand what you're doing. It's just not the same thing as what I'm doing. And, come into my home, I will feed you my smorgasbord, and it will have different items in it from yours, but maybe there'll be crossovers as well. Now, I've tried to institutionalize this idea as well. So one of the things I did when I came to Harvard was I started a weekly seminar series that I called the STS Circle. I explicitly go out and invite people who are not themselves in STS. I mean, for one thing, Harvard does not have a degree program in STS, so I couldn't fill it with my own PhDs. I do invite some of my own fellows. But I go to MIT and I ask them who is doing STS there. I go to the History of Science department, the Anthropology department. I look at the young fellows passing through in a given year, and I ask the scientists themselves, the ones who are publicly engaged, and people from the policy school. So if you look at these 22 seminars that we have every academic year, you will find that it's a broad tent. And the excitement comes from these encounters of people who may not have understood how their work relates to STS, and then the STS people recognizing themselves in this other body of work as well. So I think that is a little bit emblematic of the way in which I want to cultivate our own Denksstil, as you called it, but at the same time show that the strength comes from border crossing in a way, from making oneself intelligible to people who are not doing quite the same thing. And maybe they recognize that, yes, after all, this is a new emergence after all.
Absolutely, and learning may take place. So perhaps in that spirit of collaboration and that idea of, well, you call it imperialism, but it's actually networking and spreading out insights into different parts of academic communities. Some might also recognize perhaps the temperament of a lawyer and a legal scholar. So to the benefit of our viewers, I should also say that you have an academic background that encompasses many fields with degrees in mathematics, linguistics, and law. And I wonder if we could stay a bit with the law, which is important in your work, both, I would say, both in the way that you work, but also, of course, when it comes to the content of the research, and especially your work on the interface between science as one modern institution and law as another very important institution. Would you like to say something about how you came into this?
Yes, well, how I came into it is completely accidental in a sense, because I had done a PhD in historical linguistics, as you note, and although I solved a very important problem of Bengali philology in my mother tongue, the market for historical linguists, especially in Indic languages, was not big in America. And then it so happens that my husband is also a distinguished historical linguist. And so the likelihood that we were going to find two equally satisfying jobs in the same university was not great. So I went to law school with no very clear idea of what was going to happen, other than that it was a useful skill and could be used. And then it turned out by different means that I first fell into the practice of environmental law when the field was just beginning to emerge, and that led somewhat accidentally to the STS program at Cornell and what I started to do there. But I think that, of course, people look back and try to make sense of their lives and try to trace logics where none existed. You could look at my academic training and say that I've always had a fondness for formal language in some sense, mathematics, linguistics, law. But I think that what has happened over time is that I also had this literary streak. I mean, I loved reading novels as a child, and, at some stage in my life, I devoured mystery stories. And, so I've been fond of language for what it expresses as well. And I think that interplay between the interpretive, the sense-making, and the formalized is something that has colored and animated how I think about the law. And then the law is extremely compatible in a sense with STS studies, because the law is also about taking things apart and putting them back together again. It's also about continuity and change. And above all, it's about order, which is a word that has appeared more and more in my writing. How is it that the orderliness of a society is achieved, especially if things are really contingent? This is something that has preoccupied microsociologists, but equally STS scholars. So in the moment, you may not know what you're doing. I mean, actually, linguistics is a profoundly important aid to thinking about that. I mean, you and I are talking. We're not aware of our minds actually making the ideas, and yet the words somehow come out of our mouths in a way that is intelligible. And, so this intelligibility, how is it achieved? And how is it achieved in a world where you actually don't know from second to second and minute to minute, let alone decade to decade, what is going to come out as being the order of things. So I think that convergence of the law's attempt to grapple with the dynamism of society and yet the orderliness of society, and STS's attempt to grapple with the contingency of reality and yet the obduracy of facts, that creates a kind of intellectual parallel that fascinates me. Not to mention the fact that law and science also make Venn diagrams of all kinds, whether it's around intellectual property or tort law, where you're looking at questions of responsibility and blame, causality. It's something that cuts across both of those realms and connects one to the other. So I think it's turned out to be, by happenstance, an extremely rich field, the intersection of law and science, in which to develop my own ideas, including co-production. I mean, how is it that the normative and the factual link up together? After all, that is a central question for co-production.
And perhaps one of the early cases that you really delved into were the cases of biotechnology, how biotechnology met the law, as it were, in the United States.
Yes, that is actually a bit of a funny story, and it says something about academic or scholarly parochialness. So my first major research project was actually about the regulation of chemicals, and it was a study of 3 European countries, Britain, France, Germany, and the US. And it turned out that by the time I finished that study, how do these 4 countries regulate cancer-causing chemicals, I became tagged as the person who knows about other countries. Now imagine in the entirety of American academia to come to be known as the person who does international things. So the Office of Technology Assessment, which was an advisory arm to the US Congress for about 20 years, it got dissolved around 1994. They were doing a series of reports on biotechnology in the early 1980s. And one of the reports they wanted to do was a cross-national survey of what's happening in biotechnology. And I got tapped to write the chapters on Germany and on Switzerland because, she knows something about these countries. So that's how I got into what then turned out to be an extremely rich vein of research, because it's one of the moving frontiers. It's involved in this new century of convergent technologies. And of course, the biological sciences, because they deal with the matter of life itself, happen to be a place for asking normative questions of the kind that have always interested me.
And out of these studies, both, as you say, both first of the regulation of chemicals and then further into biotechnology, we got concepts such as regulatory science and the fifth branch. I wonder, would you like to tell us what is the power of the fifth branch?
I've been actually very surprised at the lasting capacity of the fifth branch, partly because, of course, I didn't know what I was doing. And it's actually a funny story that this is how I became an STS scholar, in a sense. There was a moment when I was studying the way peer review is used in what I was already thinking of as regulatory science. Regulatory science, very simply put, was the label I put onto science that is generated for purposes of regulation, for purposes of making public policy. And within that domain, people were increasingly calling for peer review. And I thought that was an interesting phenomenon. What is so magical about peer review that they're continually wanting to do it? And then I got some funding to carry out a study of peer review. And at the first phase, I became a little bit bored because what was it? Just an inventory? Oh yeah, this law requires it and that law requires it. And so I was getting a little bit frustrated, and as often happens, and will happen again tomorrow, I needed to give a little lecture at a professional society meeting, and I had no idea. I didn't want to just get up and say, you know, the Clean Air Act requires peer review and the Toxic Substances Control Act requires peer review. Many people give those talks. I've always found them not very helpful. But then I started thinking about it, and it turned out that what the chemical industry wanted to regard as peers were radically different from what the administrators and the regulatory agencies wanted to regard as peers. So there was a kind of basic science versus applied science split. The regulators wanted scientists who were knowledgeable about the purposes of regulation, and industry wanted scientists who had nothing to do with regulation. So in a sense, what became interesting to observe about peer review was the wrestling, the social struggle over the very meaning of peer. And that was what I ended up talking about. A young person came out of the audience and said to me, you know, it was sort of like a Molière moment. Do you realize that you were talking STS? And invited me to submit that piece to Social Studies of Science. That young person was Thomas Gearin. That was how I became exposed to the idea of boundary work, and the rest became history.
That's a wonderful story, really. So you mentioned already your profoundly comparative approach. I've read your studies of, for instance, how biotechnology was regulated and dealt with in different countries. And some may remember the idea of product, process, and program as different approaches to regulate biotechnologies. Would you like to tell us a bit about how this came about and what you found?
With pleasure, because this is actually a major continuing strand in my research, and one that gives me a huge amount of satisfaction. But exactly how, that is a thing that has changed over the years. I mean, I think part of the story I'm telling is that through scholarship, one discovers oneself as well. I mean, every decade is an attempt to think back, what was I actually doing in that time? The comparative research is something that, again, I fell into rather accidentally, and thereby hangs a funny tale as well. When I came to Cornell, a group of 3 very junior scholars had submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation to study chemical regulation in France, Britain, and the US. And NSF liked the idea of doing comparative research. It was quite new to them. But they said, if you're going to do this, you have to include Germany, because that's Europe's biggest chemicals producing nation. And you have to have some competence in law if you're going to look at regulation at all. I was just moving to Ithaca with my husband and had been offered a postdoctoral position, but I had to write a proposal for what I was going to do. And I said I was going to study the implementation of the Toxic Substances Control Act. I barely knew what implementation even meant. That was not in my law training. But it was the most recent of the big environmental laws. So here I come, knowing German, having legal training from Harvard Law School, wanting to study chemicals, and NSF has told these young colleagues that they should find a law person and add Germany. So we redrafted the proposal, we got funded, and that's how I landed in comparative research. I mean, it's all a matter of happenstance and happy accidents and convergences in a way. But at that time, the colleagues I was working with were political scientists, and they were very much in this causal explanatory paradigm that you look at countries and you see similarities and differences, and those are the dependent variables. There must be independent variables, factors that explain why. All our political science colleagues told us that this was a bad project because there were no independent variables that were different across these countries. They had the same political structures, they were democracies, similar social movements, similar welfare states committed to public health, and similar chemicals lobbies. I mean, you know, it was for the imagination of the standard political scientist. There was not much to be gained from this comparative study. So it was a huge eye-opener to me, because it turned out that the differences lay in places where political scientists had not found differences, particularly in the construction of public knowledge. So, of course, that became a theme in my work. I mean, how is it that people, at the very sort of most basic level, what that study forced me to ask was, how is it that people take the same scientific literature, the same studies were being cited everywhere, but they draw such different conclusions from this literature and come to different policy conclusions? So from that starting point of how do you explain how the same observations can lead to different results, I think my interests in the kinds of questions I was asking, they began evolving. So at one time I thought, well, at the beginning when I was doing controlling chemicals and even into subsequent work, that there must be structural features of these countries. Maybe it's about the ways they use expertise, such as negotiated versus adversarial forms of rulemaking, that help explain things. But I think as time has gone by, I think a few somewhat different things. So one of those things is that doing comparative research really gives us the closest real-life experience of being a Martian that you could imagine. I mean, you know how it's a thought experiment. People often say in the social sciences, imagine the Martian landing in your community and what would they see? And it's a convenient way of estranging what you do to allow you a sideways glimpse. But doing comparative research does that work for you. It's like there are numerous little Marses, and we can hop from one to another and see, you know, how the same ingredients are being ordered in different ways. And that has turned out to be a lasting observation that has proved very rich for me. Why is it that Fukushima happens and Germany, which has no earthquakes and no tsunamis, decides that it's going to phase out the remaining nuclear power plants? I mean, this is not rational according to any meaning of rationality that would be understood by my colleagues in nudge theory, for instance. And yet it happens. You know, Galileo is said to have said, "Eppur si muove," under his breath. And, you know, I think about these worlds, you know, that these two are moving according to their own lights. So this existence of parallel worlds that take the stuff of life, but order it in different ways, that to me has been the big, big payoff from comparative research, because it feeds in an understandable, scientifically addressable way how alternative realities can be constructed. You don't have to fantasize about alternate pathways. People are adopting alternate pathways. And in a time like ours, when there's one crisis after another and everybody is in search of alternatives, it's extremely valuable to be able to say, well, look, these people have done X and somehow they've managed to make it stick. Let's at least try to understand that. It's not that you can import that world into yours. It would be too wrenching. But nevertheless, there is an aspirational state, perhaps, that we want to attain, and it helps to see how other people have attained it. There may be actual tools and techniques that one would learn. For instance, for the arts of negotiation, I think many people in negotiation theory read some of my comparative work because it helps them understand something about negotiation when knowledge and technology are part of the game. So in that sense, the comparative work has proved enormously sustaining for me as a source of theoretical insight, empirical richness, but above all, this normative sense that you can, after all, define the good in different ways and, you know, play the cost-benefit game, not according to a straight-up, the one exceeds the other, but how do we actually think about what the costs and benefits of being in a society might look like.
Yeah, because also we can learn from each other, of course. And this led to, among other things, this concept of civic epistemologies that I think has been important for many scholars in our field. And of course, the broader vision that you're outlining now, that leads us to the question of what is public reason, what constitutes public reason in different societies.
Yes, so many people think that learning from somebody else means adopting a better answer. I mean, like building the better mousetrap. And if we see how they are doing it, we can learn that. Now, I've never thought that policy learning works like that. I mean, because I think these cultural ways of being, I think of civic epistemologies, after all, I defined it that way, as a property of political culture, something very deep-seated. This is the way people are committed to knowing things together. You can't suddenly wipe the slate clean and say, tomorrow I will adopt, the Enquête Commission or the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority from Britain as my model. It just would not work in America, which is not centralized, but is decentralized, and a federal system like Germany, but not so much like Britain, which has a different federation. So one should think about learning in a more complex way, not just that it's like a supermarket and I can go and find the best available combination of, taste and price and just get it. But I think what one learns is reflexivity. I mean, one learns to think, how are these pieces put together for ourselves? So one of the examples that one might think about right now, given just at this moment what is happening in America, is how would America ever learn to be sensible about guns? It's not going to happen by saying, well, look, after Dunblane, the UK banned certain kinds of weapons and it's been very successful. Or after Port Arthur, Australia did this and it was very successful and people turned in their guns. That is just, or Christchurch in New Zealand. So it's not going to happen. But how would it happen is a question that is preoccupying people right now. One of the curious things we've done, so civic epistemologies might tell us, well, any solution in America is more likely to be legalistic, more likely to be pushed through the legal system than by broad political consensus. And if it is going to be pushed through the legal system, again, the civic epistemologies approach would tell you that a market-oriented approach is more likely to work in America than one that involves the state. That is simply because, by predilection, we prefer solutions that look like markets. We can talk more about that if you wish. But in other countries, the fear of big government is not so enormous. So, one is more inclined to go for national solutions or society-wide solutions. Now, a wrinkle in American law then becomes very important. And it is that gun companies are shielded against liability by federal law, which is, for instance, not true of tobacco companies. And this led a number of years ago to the huge tobacco settlement in America, because tobacco companies were suddenly held responsible for having misled people and caused a huge number of deaths. So it gives you something to target as a matter of policy if you understand the role being played by these kinds of exemptions that are carved out by law inside of the American system. And so what is the more general point? I think the more general point about civic epistemologies is that this is not like different shopping baskets and you can go out and, pick the best answer. It's really an invitation to cultivate greater reflectiveness about one's own system. And then with the profound knowledge that people have about their own systems, figure out what would you need to change, what would you need to target in order to get from point A to point B. It may be a very different path. Even the points A and B might look a bit different from other people's. But what you carry away from the comparative research is a much deeper understanding of why we behave in the ways we do. And there are always interstices. There are always other pathways to be found. So that, I think, is the benefit of being reflective.
Yeah. And as you speak, I am thoroughly convinced. And then I wonder if in your interaction with policymakers, with organizations, in Europe and in across the Atlantic and even the OECD, do you find it possible to communicate this message of reflexivity and complex learning?
So I should take a step back and say that I don't directly advise policymakers, except in areas of science policy and research policy. That is a place where I'm routinely called upon. And I'm also not arrogant enough to think that just because I go and say something, it has any impact. I think the impact comes more from training the other people who are going to do the bridge building in different ways. And by now, I've trained enough young people who've gone out into the consulting world, the public policy world, the corporate world, and they tell me that these ways of thinking are extremely useful to them, whether in constructing a negotiation or even advising people and writing laws. So one of the most dramatic examples of this was in a case that happened in 2013 in the US Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled, to everybody's surprise, that human genes are not patentable. Now, that question had not been put in such stark terms to the US Supreme Court. But in 1980, there was a famous decision called Diamond versus Chakrabarty, which said that if it is human-made and is, in some sense, an invention, then it is patentable. And because human genes don't occur isolated in nature, people assumed that if you have the technology to isolate the gene, or indeed fragments of genes, you can freely patent those. So that was the way it was understood, that anything under the sun that is made by man was the rubric. And, so it was understood that human genes in that sense were made by man because, and the language was gendered in the original, and therefore it was patentable. But the person who spearheaded this Supreme Court case, which came to the surprising but opposite conclusion that you cannot patent human genes, was somebody who had studied biology and society with me as an undergraduate at Cornell. And then she led a life of much more being in the practical world. She joined the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, in New York, where there were very talented litigators, but they had never thought about turning intellectual property law into a matter of civil liberties. And so it was a landmark case for them. But it's an actual example of somebody who learned something in a classroom at a very early age and then did this translation. So that's much more the way that, that I imagine having an impact. It's not the life that life of sort of daily changes in the way that my problem space is defined is not the one that I want to be in. But I want to give other people who do enjoy that life more to have the skills so that they can see that this is what they're doing. The other day, I met a young woman who graduated from Harvard 2 years ago, and she's learning to be a nuclear engineer in the Navy. And she studied environmental politics with me as an undergraduate. And she said, it's just fascinating. I keep looking at the ways in which STS issues are constantly coming up. I haven't tried to influence anything as yet, she said. But, it's a promising space. I mean, after all, if our defense experts of the future and people who are staffing our nuclear submarines are actually trained in STS, then, maybe one will see changes or see changes even in those sorts of domains.
Absolutely. And it's about this care, about the careful, empirical, the care for empirical detail, among other things, isn't it? And I was thinking, you write in the introductory essay of your collection, Science and Public Reason, this sentence says, reason is achieved, not attained. And I think that is what you are describing now. And the way it is achieved is a question of empirical inquiry. And yet, of course, it may be that there are philosophers around who would say, but, well, it is true that we should do descriptive empirical studies, so what is actually happening out there, but yet again, reason is something that should be defined almost, as it were, axiomatically from philosophical arguments, perhaps. I wonder if you would comment on this, of STS as also a way of doing perhaps even political philosophy.
Yes, I'm really glad you asked that. I mean, while having high respect for political philosophers, I've never understood what quite gives them the right to say that their understanding of reason should trump everybody else's. I mean, at the very least, a sort of prime mandate, be reflexive, makes one think that maybe one should consider where one's own entitlement to articulate right reason comes from. Now, I think that in any society and in any period of time, there are things that people hold, and some of these things may be almost universal. I mean, we don't usually attribute causality to something that happens after something else in terms of time, but it's embedded in the very definition of cause, a sense of temporality, relative temporality. And there's no reason why science fiction authors are always playing around with these kinds of things, and the future could be a cause of the first in speculative fiction. So I'm not even saying that it's completely out of the question. Still and all, the claim that this is right reason and this is the best way to reason is a very hubristic position. It's particularly hubristic if one takes democracy as an important thing, because how do we know that somebody else isn't reasoning the best they can with the resources at their disposal? How is it that we, academics, for instance, who occupy privileged positions, can go to them and say that you were doing something irrational because you just don't know? And what should you know? I mean, for instance, if you want to tell somebody you're doing something irrational vis-a-vis climate change by cutting down your tree, well, then you have to say, well, what is that tree doing in your domestic economy, and why are you cutting it down? And, years ago, this is a cartoon I've written something about. There's this famous Yo Amigo cartoon that shows some person in, I think, a Latin American country, a little small figure that is trying to chop down a tree, and somebody, clearly a caricatured American, comes up in a car and it's belching fumes, and the American person yells out to the Latin American person, save that tree because I need it for, to offset my emissions, is the idea. So I think that the idea of a singular rationality from which you argue for public reason is every bit as problematic, shall we say, as the idea of a singular set of facts out there that are independent of the ways in which we represent them. So when I say reason is achieved, I mean that it's a bit the way STS scholars think about facts, that what we agree is reason is something that we work out. And of course, many political philosophers, like my distinguished Holberg predecessor, Jürgen Habermas, have talked about spaces of reasoning as themselves forming a kind of ideal community in which, I think he would agree that reason is achieved as the end point of a process and not as the beginning point of a process. So I think that is the inversion that I would go along with. It's not that there are no better and worse standards of reasoning in a society. It's that they are the result of historical processes, institutional approaches. And then if you look cross-culturally, you see that the what counts as reason, operates very differently in different places. You were talking about careful empirical research. Even more than the care, I think once you're really immersed in the spirit of STS, you find that the most minuscule observations about the world open up an entire territory of thought. One of these is a report of our National Academy of Sciences that I saw that was comparative. I didn't have anything to do with it this time. It was surveying different approaches to constructing expert knowledge on climate change. And they described the German Enquete-Kommission, which, as you know, is the parliamentary commission that is sometimes appointed to give advice on difficult legislative issues. And the presumption in the German system is that this inquiry commission will have the same proportionality of political representation as does Parliament itself. So the expert body is a political microcosm at the same time that it is also an expert body. And this US National Academy's report said that this was going off on the wrong track because it politicizes the science. But politicizing the science is only a concept in America and not in other places. In other places, it's understood that science is a politicized domain to start with. And then maybe the Inquiry Commission is a way of depoliticizing to some extent, because it says that all these points of view must be there, whereas we, in our purest arrogance, lose sight of the fact that asking for pure scientific positions may actually harden or consolidate particular kinds of values in there and not open them up to negotiation in the same way. These are just some of the kinds of observations that lead me to have my constructivist views about reason, while at the same time not normatively losing sight of the need for reason or the need for shared standards of logic. These are things that I would always subscribe to.
Absolutely. I would like us to turn into this question, also the more normative aspects that we could pursue there. So an alternative to arrogance and hubris would be humility. And I think this is an incredibly important part of your scholarship as well, to think about how could we, for instance, as you wrote, now it's almost 20 years ago, how could we make technologies of humility? This may sound a bit strange or surprising to people. What would technologies of humility be like?
It's a bit difficult for me to answer the question about technologies of humility, because frankly, I was taken aback at how that phrase caught hold and how it's circulated around the world. And of course, like anything one says, it's also subject to misinterpretation in different ways. I think what I had in mind back at the turn of the century, it's important to remember what that time was. It was a decade after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and it was still a somewhat triumphalist period. People were imbued with a kind of millennial fervor, and things were going to get better, and yet 9/11 had happened. And so it was obvious that these rosy images of how we were now in what Americans might call the kumbaya world, everybody join hands and sit in a circle and sing the same song, that this is not what was going to happen. But science and technology have always been in the business of charting out progress for us. They see themselves as progressive institutions. No person who's trained in engineering thinks that that person is making the world a worse place, right? There are people, very thoughtful engineers, who have discovered that their brand of physics is only useful for weapons manufacturing, and they have stopped being physicists as a result. But by and large, if you do one of the scientific fields or engineering fields, you think that it is for the benefit of the world in some sense. And that is partly because it's always a progressive, futuristic imagination. We've grown much more ambitious in what we're able to predict or project. Already in 1970, there was this idea of limits to growth, but that was based on the first very large-scale computer modeling that people were doing. So we've seen cycles come and cycles go of a certain kind of arrogance about predicting the future. And it's always seemed to me strange that we don't look at our inabilities in the present while we're projecting all these things for the future. I remember having a conversation once in which we were asked to say, what do you think Harvard can contribute to the problem of public health? Because it was something like the 75th anniversary of Harvard School of Public Health. And I said, you know, before we start talking about global health and how we can contribute to it, maybe we should consider why it is that in our own country, in the United States, we have, you know, some sizable portion of the population showing the same level of health indicators as in the developing world. I mean, every bit as bad. So why don't we solve that problem at home first? And maybe that's a political problem. And there was dead silence, and after that, I think I was not invited back to any other discussions of global public health policy. I mean, this is why I'm not actually advising policymakers, to tell the truth. So why is it that we look forward and not backward when history often supplies lessons? And I think the Technologies of Humility piece was to point out that there are systematically areas that could be subjected to scientific analysis and STS analysis where we don't look. And I think the most important point was that we project without looking at distributive consequences. And that has led to some devastating results for American democracy and maybe others as well. So the globalization predictions that came about in the 1990s in particular, that said, if you open up markets worldwide, it'll lead to cheaper commodities and everybody will be better off. Clearly, they had not really thought about the distributive impact throughout the United States, that manufacturing would be sucked off into Southeast Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and in particular large in China, so that in effect America would be left without its manufacturing base. But what would happen to those people? I remember co-advising a PhD thesis sometime in the 1990s at Cornell, where the student, who was a very good student, had predicted that the northern states were turning blue. Blue is for Democrats, progressives, and would stay blue. Well, we know that in the 2016 election, Michigan and Wisconsin were two of the states that were in this, you know, will turn blue prediction that ended up voting for Donald Trump. And, you know, if you want to finger point at single causes, it's about employment. It's about the Rust Belt. It's about manufacturing industries leaving and leaving people, therefore, with no jobs, no hope, children not doing better than parents, which is kind of, again, inverting the desired for order of things. And it's led to really pretty unfortunate political consequences in America. So I think that to the extent I was saying in Technologies of Humility that we should not be so arrogant and so confident about our predictions of the future, partly because I think we always over-exaggerate the capacity of prediction, but that I was also saying there are things we could learn about ourselves with a look at distribution, with a look at learning, with a look at, you know, why some people gain and others lose every time we adopt change, that these are also parallel areas of inquiry that should go hand in hand with the hubristic, projective, future-making strands in our thinking. You know, I would obviously hold on to that, and I think that people have resonated with that idea.
And perhaps one way of saying this is that future making remains rather selective and narrow, perhaps in some of these elites where the power is concentrated. And that leads me to another concept that has caught on to such a degree that perhaps you don't even recognize it always even, and that's your concept together with co-authors on socio-technical imaginaries, which I guess is, if we ask people in the street around at the university campus what they recently read of Sheila Jasanoff's work, they will say something about socio-technical imaginaries, perhaps.
So, of course, one can't exactly complain if one's ideas catch hold. And one, I mean, if you're trained in anything to do with rhetoric and discourse, you know that you don't have control over your words the moment they leave your mouth anyway, and people will hear what they want to hear and use things in certain ways. And maybe even development comes through that kind of user-oriented reappropriation in some sense. But again, I've been taken a little bit by surprise at the way this has caught on. One reason is a little bit proprietary in a sense, because for me, socio-technical imaginaries are just one manifestation of co-production. I mean, that is in my own thought, co-production, which is this idea, this synthetic idea that we make the world or understand the world in certain ways because these are also the worlds that we want to live in, and vice versa, that once we've understood the world in certain ways, it also imposes an ethic of having to live in that world in somewhat almost deterministic ways. So that idea of co-production, that the is and the ought are synthetically co-produced, of course leads one to think, what are the worlds that we're producing now for the future, and, what does the future begin to look like as a space of political action, as a space that we want to shape and strive toward in certain ways. And then I was interested in how things like the strands of is and ought combine in projecting these futures. So for me, the analytic power of socio-technical imaginaries comes at a level that is different from the immediate action plan that somebody is trying to pursue, right? I mean, so I think in the Nordic countries where the energy transition has been a very big topic of conversation, there's been a temptation to say every time you find two people who hold different ideas, I mean, should there be, deep underground burial of nuclear wastes in Finland or not? Or, should Norway switch to, more hydropower at the expense of fossil fuels, or what is Norway's responsibility for using fossil fuels? That people take the two sides of a policy debate and say these are alternative imaginaries. That's not the interesting level. The interesting level is the one about the social compact. What is the underlying social compact? The idea of collective responsibility, what kinds of good futures people are wanting for themselves that are at stake in public political debates. Now, if you look at it that way, then a policy debate may not actually come from very different sources. So in the American case, which of course I'm most familiar with, you will get very different policy positions, but where they will agree is that the solution lies in the individual, not in the collective. So right now, we're having this gun control debate, and it's interesting that the only place where people are going to be able to forge compromise is probably on mental health checks. But mental health can be seen as a highly individualized problem. And for purposes of this legislation, that is how it will be seen. Take the individual who has a mental health issue. The fact that the mental health itself might be a collective product is never in the discourse. It's the rotten apple syndrome. Take out the rotten apple and then the barrel will be good, and the good guns and the good people will jostle around and nothing will happen. You take out the one individual who's crooked or bad or malformed in some way. So again, a profoundly individualized recourse. And then the state power is okay as long as it's being targeted toward taking out these dangerous individuals and taking care of them in some way. So the balance of state and market, what is private enterprise and what is public responsibility, that remains constant in this kind of adoption of solutions. And so it becomes almost a kind of game to follow policy debates in any area in America and see how quickly they get turned into this understanding of what the dominating social compact is, not the welfare state, but the state that privileges something that looks like the market, and then state power is used below the surface to enable those market solutions to thrive in certain ways. And, I've been running a quite big comparative study of COVID policies. It's been very interesting to see how the reconstruction of the economy after the 2-year pause has followed these kinds of deeper commitments, which to me are, somewhat the essence of the imaginary. I mean, that is, how do people imagine their societies cohering, holding together and making progress?
Which would you say are the most striking comparative differences with regard to the COVID that you have seen so far?
So one of the differences has been in what you take to be the threat and what do you target. Now, these are never binaries. It's never either or. But is the bulk of your attention directed against the virus, or is the bulk of your attention directed against the social habits by which people spread the virus? So if you take the zero COVID countries, to some extent, their way of struggling against the virus has been to erect these border walls and keep it out totally. They're the countries like New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, China that have imposed some of the most severe travel restrictions, that foreign bodies bearing the virus can't come in. And then they've imposed very strict laws on motion, on isolation, etc., on people. South Korea is an interesting case because of the degree to which they're relying on, both South Asia and Singapore, on mobile phones and apps to make sure that you're not violating these social prescriptions. On the other hand, for the US, the quarrel has become a medical one. I mean, so you want to prevent the infection, and therefore all of our energies were placed into finding the cure and the therapy. And vaccination then became the savior. Whereas in these other societies where the society could be controlled so as not to spread the virus, the vaccination rates lagged. And in a sense, the latest Shanghai crisis in China was a result of that, because the Chinese had relied on the border controls not to allow the virus to come in the first place, and therefore were not relying on making the individual body more resistant to the virus. Anyway, these are very nuanced kinds of differences, but in our sort of first cut through, we said that there were 3 types of response. One was containment, where the virus was kept out. One was consensus, where the virus could not be kept out, but there was a high level of social consensus about what were the right things to do. And then the third one was chaos, where, you didn't know from day to day. And there was no coordination at high policy levels, neither social coordination nor antiviral coordination. And so Brazil, India, the US, at times the UK fell into this chaos pattern, whereas Germany and the smaller Sweden and the Netherlands were in our study. They were more in the consensus box, and several of the Asian countries, but also Australia, were in the containment box.
This is very interesting. I think it will be material for scholarship for decades. I would like to turn to your latest book for a moment. Can Science Make Sense of Life? So we have discussed quite a lot these comparative differences that you find. And yet perhaps there are features of modernity at the stage in which it is in, where there are also similarities across countries and continents, and almost a kind of hegemonical position for certain ideas or even values. When I read your last book, I got the impression that perhaps the concern was more explicitly normative than before. Would you agree?
I don't think that it's more normative than before. I think just the format of writing a short book meant that I had to distill certain things, and maybe also in the period of life I'm in, I'm thinking about the what really matters question more than I used to, in a sense. There's also the sheer observational quality of the object of study, which is biological manipulation. And I've been really struck at the way in which the invention of CRISPR technologies has been interpreted as a kind of carte blanche to edit everything in sight. I mean, so first of all, seeing human life as text, and then the project of the biological sciences as being running a spell check. I mean, this is an explicit thing that Feng Zhang, my colleague at MIT, says. I mean, that it's just like running a spell check, and you find the sort of global search produces all the errors and you just correct them. But that's such a completely materialistic and individualized way of understanding what is the matter with life, as well as what is the matter of life, that, you know, I was interested in really exploring all the ways in which that understanding is much too reductionist. That if we're to concern ourselves with what lawyers see as the matter of life, that is, life as it is lived, life in communities, life that is relational, life that is purposive, then, you know, I think locating all defects in the genes is really an extraordinary move of reduction. And yet this is where the money goes. So just recently I heard a talk, it was in fact in a panel where I was another of the speakers, where somebody was talking in a very confident way about how we already know enough to edit the sleeping-related genes in people so that they would sleep less. Now, this is partly supposed to be great because then you can produce people in certain professions where they never need to sleep. So soldiers, for instance, I mean, you know, in the battlefield, you can keep them awake, you know, for longer periods of time. But then I was wondering, to what extent have these same researchers studied what happens to a society when everybody is wakeful? And, you know, if you're a woman, as I am, and have raised children as I have, but also male parents, I think, they know very well what it means to have a sleepless infant. And then if that sleeplessness is now blown up into a social trait, it's like what happens to an entire global society when it suddenly becomes hyper for 4 to 6 more hours a day. I mean, you know, that's actually a sort of funny thing. You could imagine it in filmic terms, that you suddenly speed up the thing and you know, it goes quicker and it produces its own kind of chaos, right? But then who is responsible for that? You know, we've been skirting the question of responsibility for innovation, but my preceding book before that was called Ethics of Invention. And I think Ethics of Invention is another step towards the very normativity that you're talking about as in Can Science Make Sense of Life? So I think this is a progression in a way. You know, supposing you have altered the human species to do certain things, according to whose design? I mean, who actually, you know, there is an example of public reason being achieved through technology, in a sense. that the technologists declare that this is inevitable and therefore we shall do it. We know that it's not inevitable. It's a matter of choice, right? I mean, so I think I was wrestling with what makes this idea of perfectibility through gene manipulation so appealing. Part of my answer is that it is the very simplicity. It's this socio-technical imaginary of the one-stop shopping. I mean, you know, take the ills of the world, reduce them to the most fundamental principles, and then bingo, if you can play with those fundamental principles, you've won the jackpot. Of course, it doesn't help that there are real jackpots to be won as well, because the person who succeeds in making the invention, turning it into a mass market drug, you know, is somebody who's going to win big. And so there are incentives for this way of thinking. But I think there's also another dimension, because after all, I am Indian by birth and lived the first 12 years of my life in India and never stopped speaking my mother tongue and moved with my nuclear family to America. And it is a different tradition. I mean, it's not any less materialist or whatever. I mean, I don't want to make cheap and easy comparisons, but I think the way in which matter and spirit relate to one another is different, and certainly was for my generation. And I find it actually troubling to think that the two are simply coterminous, that the one thing can become the other thing. I mean, I think my work on imaginaries, my work on civic epistemologies for that matter, that these are all also humanistic attempts to say that the material understanding of anything, of technology, of human beings, of society, that this is not enough, that there are other things such as aspirations and norms and yearnings and inchoate sensibilities and senses of ambivalence, that these things are also part of who we are. And maybe one can, you know, find the ambivalence gene, but that's a joke. But if we found it, I would hope for humanity's sake that we would not choose to correct it.
If we look into the crystal ball, I mean, you're reminding us of issues of gun control and CRISPR and gene editing, and we could have used even more violent examples of the day. Are we at a stage where you see modernity moving into some kind of madness rather than public reason? Or how are you going to theorize what is happening seemingly at all fronts as we speak?
So a book that I was very drawn to in my undergraduate days, and that I think also has a good deal of resonance in the Scandinavian countries, is Lord of the Rings. And in Lord of the Rings, there are numerous moments in which people look into the equivalent of crystal balls. There's Galadriel's mirror, but there's also the Palantir. And perhaps we know that Peter Thiel, a notable imaginer of the world, made a company that he called Palantir, which is driven by data science and actually intends to predict the shape of the world. But I think in Lord of the Rings, this urge to, I mean, it's very consistent with the idea of technologies of humility, the urge to predict by looking into the crystal ball came surrounded with warnings that it's a very partial vision. This could happen, but it need not happen. And I think that it would be foolhardy in the extreme to imagine that one has a crystal ball that gives the reality of something as complex as a world. I think my own sense of prediction and temporality is also shaped by living between countries and also in a country like India that is so full of contradiction. So you can go, 50 kilometers and be hundreds of years back in time, in a sense. Ways of life are persisting, but even in the most highly modernized societies, I mean, you know, just think about the place of, you know, hiking and fishing in Norwegian life and how old those traditions are. I was actually amused at one time to learn that the Danes apparently export more sperm than any other country, and I was thinking that this perhaps is a residue of a Viking culture in some sense, but maybe that's pushing STS analysis too far. But the serious point is that inside of highly modernist traditions, there lurk residues of other things. You can be like Bruno Latour, another very distinguished predecessor of mine in the Holberg genealogy, and his book, We Have Never Been Modern. But I think he was talking about the fact that in contemporary life, the seeming facticity of the world is something that is actually distilled out of hybridity. For me, it's more a temporality matter, that I think that in different aspects of our lives, we retain different forms of attachment to past and different senses of how that should affect the future. So I think that from my perspective, it's not so much looking at crystal balls. It's really the normative position, I think, is at the end of the day reflexivity. I mean, that is, look into the heart of your society in the process, look into your own heart as well, and see where the impetus for collective evil on a massive scale, or even collective aberrations, you know, where that lodges, how it's propagated, you know, it's as if the dreamscapes of modernity have within them also the nightmarescapes of modernity, and how do the two, in some sense, fit together? If we had been thinking in those ways, then the Ukraine war would not have come as a surprise, right? There were enough straws in the wind. But one can forget the Ukraine war as just a tragedy of the moment. It's a much more general fact that has come out of all of my own disaster studies, that the straws in the wind were always there, that in hindsight, you always see what straws there were. That in itself has served many people as the end point of their analysis. They say, you know, we're bad at learning, we should have been able to foretell. That's not really what interests me. What interests me is why, as a very general proposition, we become wiser after the fact. And what is it about the institutional structures, about the very habits of reason that disable us from seeing certain things? And there, you know, maybe this is a way to conclude by saying that although I'm a secular person by upbringing and by inclination, of course I was brought up in a culture that had different legends, different mythologies, and different religious traditions as well. And one of them was Buddhism, which did not take root in India beyond a point, but is one of the achievements of that society. And what was the formative element in the Buddha's life? I mean, he was born a prince, and there was a foretelling that he would not die a prince. And so his parents took huge pains to shield him against the evils that were outside the walls. And so I think modernity is a bit like that. Modernity tells us a progress story and cocoons us in the life getting always better and better morality. And it keeps us from going out into the world outside our own worlds and encountering for the first time old age and poverty and sickness and death. But that is what gave rise to the understanding. So not that any of us are cut out to be religious leaders, and especially not a fairly a-religious temperament like mine, but that grand lesson that you owe yourself a duty, in a sense, to understand how misery survives in a world of plenty, and what it is that plenty does to set itself up as the exemplar of progress. If we could do those things, I think that would be far, far more powerful than looking into any crystal ball.
Professor Sheila Jasanoff, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure and a great honor.